Planes hitting New York City, thousands now are dead. It was Arab terrorists, this is what you said. Well, if that is the truth, then what have you got to hide? What were you doing on the day all those people died?
Welcome, my name is Lynn Pentz, and we're here in San Francisco just after the international inquiry, the citizens' inquiry into the truth behind 9/11. Today we have three of the amazing researchers who have been committed for some long time in finding out what actually happened, what went wrong. Is it possible that this could have not happened? Is there some historical context that suggests that 911 was actually an inside job? They have buttons here. When history repeats itself, linking it somehow to, you know, Hitler and Reichstag, and that somehow Bush and his involvement was paralleled that in some way. You see buttons here from the event that Bush and Cheney should be in jail. We have people here that have spent a great deal of time exploring these issues and seem to be aligned with what is on this poster here that says 911 was not something that had to happen. So to discuss that, we have here Nafeez Ahmed, who is the author of The War on Freedom, How and Why America Was Attacked on September 11th, and I think you also did a second book, right? Behind the War on Terror, Western Secret Strategy in the Struggle for Iraq. In the center here we have Barrie Zwicker, and who is a noted Canadian journalist and also the producer of the rather amazing, insightful The Great Deception, in which you unveil a lot of these mysteries and ask some very serious questions and seek to answer them far beyond what it appears that the National Commission on 911 seems to be doing. Thanks for being here. In addition to that, we have Paul Thompson, who's author of the very famous 911 timeline. And you have a book coming up.
Now it's just on the web.
Currently it's on the web, and you have actually taken all the events of 911 and put them in some sort of sequential order. So we'd like to discuss that with you tonight, which leads you to certain conclusions. Gentlemen, could you tell me, how is it that you were sparked to get involved in this incredibly controversial and for many people very painful exploration in what actually happened on 911?
Well, for me personally, when I first was watching it happen on TV, I completely never thought of the idea that there could be any kind of complicity or foreknowledge or anything like that. I just bought the official line, absolutely, completely, and I was stuck like that for a long time.
And what's the official line, would you say?
Well, the official line is that, you know, this was Al-Qaeda terrorists, they did it entirely. The Bush administration had absolutely nothing to do with it. There was no fault or meaningful mistake by the government that could help mean that they should be held to account.
Mm-hmm. Maybe they made a few mistakes, and maybe they'll do better
errors,
next
mistakes,
time.
but nothing that they can really held account for.
Yes.
You know, nothing they can be prosecuted for or anything like that. And then I encountered the work of Michael Rupert on the stock trading that suggested that somebody clearly had advanced warning. And was using the information that they had to make a profit on the attacks. And then I also encountered the work of Professor Michel Chossudovsky about Osama bin Laden and Pakistan connection, Osama bin Laden, post-Cold War relations with Al-Qaeda in the Balkans and so on and so forth. And I have to say that these two authors really blew the whole can of worms wide open for me. And that was when I really started researching it and looking at the stuff that was out there, and it just got big. I just really began to look at all the different pieces of the puzzle, and it just came together. And in fact, I never thought I would write a book on 9/11. It just, what I had just grew bigger and bigger, and then that was it. Really, it was after a while it became very clear to me that the Bush administration, even the Clinton administration, was systematically implementing policies that facilitated what happened in 9/11.
Mm-hmm. And where are you from?
Well, I'm born and bred in England. I'm a vintage East Londoner, but I'm living in Brighton right now. And I have a small voluntary think tank, the Institute for Policy Research and Development.
So you're quite clear that 911 didn't just hit America or Americans, but rather it was a global
Well, certainly it's a global issue because it's had an absolutely global impact. Mm-hmm. I mean, 9/11 has become the linchpin for this global war on terror, which is ultimately a war on human rights, freedom, and civil liberties around the world.
Mm-hmm. Barrie, tell us how you got involved, please.
Well, I, unlike Nafeez, was suspicious about it very, very early, like actually on the day. It's interesting how different people twigged at different times and for different reasons.
Right.
In my own case, I had been critical of U.S. foreign policy for a long time and a student of Chomsky and so on. And I was vaguely aware that there had been large deceptions in history. I certainly knew about the Reichstag fire. And so on the day, leaving out a few details, we found ourselves in the living room, myself and my wife, and one of our tenants. We have 2 tenants in our basement apartment. And so along about 10 o'clock, I thought it was a terrorist attack. Which we were already told it was, and I was buying that. And then I said, you know, one thing, I hope some good can come out of this. I just hope that some of these Americans who don't understand how toxic their foreign policy has been for decades will wake up and understand that there are going to be reactions if you go around the world killing and murdering people the way, you know, the U.S. foreign policy has done. And my tenant said, no, they won't learn that at all. And they that's not going to happen at all. I said, what do you mean, Ken? He said, they're just going to bomb the shit out of somebody. And of course, he was more right than I was, I guess. And then shortly after that, I've always been interested in aviation. I said, where are the jet fighters?
Right.
And I said, where are they? I couldn't believe it then, and I can't believe it to this day. So that was my opening. And I thought since, when people say, well, Osama bin Laden did it, I would paraphrase Nafeez exactly, I would say, well, would Osama bin Laden have the power to stand down the U.S. Air Force?
Good question.
You know, I don't think so. So that's my, when I became connected to the issue.
I understand. Thank you. Paul.
As for me, it's a bit of a combination. I wish I could have been as perceptive as Barrie here. On the day of 9/11, I had sort of a feeling that something wasn't quite right, having to do with, again, where are the fighter planes? But I think the overwhelming nature of the whole thing and just the shock, I pushed that out of my brain. And it wasn't until about 9 months later, when a lot of stories started all breaking at the same time, the story of the memo that Bush received a month before that it was titled Bin Laden to Strike in U.S., and the Colleen Rowley whistleblower coming out and other whistleblowers coming out. And up until that point, I'd been just like, I think, almost every American, and just accepting everything at face value, you know, putting the flag on the car and all these things. And once I started looking into these stories that were coming out, and then I just wanted to know more, and I went to the web, and thank God for the web, and found Michael Rupert's site.
On the Wilderness.
From the Wilderness.
From the Wilderness.com.
And he had a timeline in there. It was very limited in nature, but it was the seeds of something. And so I thought, wow, that's a really great resource. And I started to use that as the framework for my understanding. And I started just for my own personal benefit and self-knowledge, I started adding to it. And it just grew and grew, because every time I found one bit of information, I was led to 3, 4 others that I wanted to know more about, and then I had to go look those up, and so it just kept growing.
Well, you've made an amazing contribution, all of you. You know, the thing, for me, like many Americans, I watched the towers go down, and as they crumbled, now I understand in 15 seconds, I thought, what? And then I looked, and having seen several buildings demolished, it occurred to me, my God, these buildings are being demolished. And they just sort of tumbled out of nowhere. No plane could have done this, no fire could have done this. And then we see juxtaposed, we see the president down at the schoolhouse. And his man, you know, whispering in his ear. and he virtually does nothing, has this kind of funny grimace on his face. But here he is, the commander-in-chief. And I was appalled. And then I wasn't appalled anymore. I was enraged. I said, there must be something going on here because he's the commander-in-chief. And isn't there a standard procedure that the Secret Service are supposed to snatch him up and take him away? And he's just casually sitting there for over 20 minutes? Something must be wrong. And I think a lot of Americans have felt something must be wrong. And you have all endeavored to answer that question. Could you tell us a little bit about the timeline, what actually happened that day, specifically with regard to the planes and NORAD and what went wrong?
Well, if I could answer that, I actually wrote an essay co-wrote an essay on what Bush was doing on 9/11. And it's incredible to think that he actually read a book about a pet goat for an additional, we don't know how long, but according to the videotape that's out there, at least 7 more minutes. And then even after that, he just continued to linger in the classroom and talk to people and shake hands. It's like he was at some sort of luncheon and fundraiser. And his behavior on that day, all around, is really quite incredible. Flying from airport to airport, and we could go on for a long time about that. But what's even more interesting, I think, is the planes and the lack of fighter response. We know that NORAD is supposed to be able to put up a plane within 15 minutes when someone gives them a call. And that was not happening on that day. The calls weren't coming in, and when they were coming in, the planes were not getting to where they were supposed to go. We just had this, I was mentioning earlier, a report in the Wall Street Journal came out a couple days ago saying that the plane that went after Flight 77, which is long after the whole thing has started, this is an hour into it, that plane flew under supersonic speed so as to not violate sound regulations in the area.
I see here one-third the speed that they were capable of.
Is
that right?
Even less than that. We're talking capabilities of 1,500 to 1,800 miles per hour, depending on the type of fighter. And in some of these planes, if you really calculate the distance, and the time that they say went from point A to point B, we're talking 200, 300 miles per hour. It just doesn't make sense.
Nafeez, what do you know about the planes and what happened on that day, the lack of U.S. military response? What is your understanding?
My understanding is very similar to Paul's. I mean, it's absolutely clear that this was a completely unprecedented event in the early hours of the morning. You have 4 planes hijacked within the space of about 20 minutes, and yet there's absolutely no response for 1.5 hours. And what is interesting is the multiple narratives that have emerged in an attempt to kind of cover up this complete and utter catastrophic failure. I mean, the NORAD timeline that Paul was mentioning, where we're presuming that indeed planes were scrambled. And one of the things I always emphasize is that in the days after the attacks, the immediate days, we have recorded testimony from senior officials confirming that absolutely no planes were scrambled until after the Pentagon was hit, which is approximately 1.5 hours. And we had this testimony from Myers, who was acting chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, from Dick Cheney, from a NORAD spokesman, General Mike Snyder, all of them confirming the same thing. And this is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, the regulations are absolutely clear. They're mandatory, they're statutory, they're followed routinely. If you look at the record historically of U.S. Air Force responses to these kind of emergencies, which are quite routine, hundreds of them have happened over the years. There's nothing like this in the history of the nation. Nothing like this at all. So for this to happen on 9/11 for 1.5 hours doesn't make any sense without some kind of decision being made somewhere. And if you look at the behavior of these officials on the day, there is no doubt that Bush, Myers, Rumsfeld, all of these people were orchestrating some kind of so-called deliberate negligence, which was clearly wired into this stand down.
So you're saying there was an official stand down that happened from the top. What were those people in the administration doing?
Well, they were play acting. I mean, you know, the evidence is that it almost makes no sense what any of them were doing. I mean, General Myers was having breakfast with somebody. He didn't think it was important enough to come out of his breakfast. Donald Rumsfeld was sitting at his office desk in the Pentagon, and apparently his telephone wasn't working because nobody told him anything. He had to just hear a thump. And if you look down through all the administration officials, practically all the top ones, they all acted in a bizarre, if not treasonous, fashion. They didn't act the way any of them should have under the circumstances. But the word catastrophic was raised, and I think what's most catastrophic really in all this is the action or inaction of the news media.
Thank you.
And this absolutely, I mean, we're assuming here for the moment that this was an inside job, that there's so much evidence that points in that direction, it's not unreasonable to hypothesize that. And if we accept that hypothesis for the moment, still, this could not have been carried off to fool the public without the acquiescence, the complicity of the mainstream media, who have not questioned a darn thing about it to this day. That is what really boggles the mind to me. And I was thinking at the time that I didn't even think of doing anything about this for my own TV program. Believe it or not, I didn't. I was thinking, well, it's so obvious there's something fishy here that the Globe and Mail or the Toronto Star or the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the Washington Post or the LA Times, that they're going to come out with big headlines saying huge questions about 9/11. That they would throw investigative teams into it. I actually naively believe they do that because it was so obvious to me that there was a gigantic story, probably the biggest story practically of all time, sitting there in front of them.
Right.
And then day after day after day went by, and I couldn't believe it. And finally, I realized, holy mackerel, maybe I have to do something about this. Actually, before I did that, I went to the top investigative reporter for the most important newspaper in Canada. And I said, can I have a meeting with you? I think there's a big story that's going on. He said, sure. He said, come over. I went over. An hour later, I was there. I said, you may think I'm crazy, but here's what I think. You know, it looks very, very suspicious. Why didn't this? Why didn't he? Says, yeah. He's making notes and everything. Then he said, yeah, I think we should look into that. I'll meet with my investigative team and look into that. Well, never heard from him again to this day. And so finally I realized maybe I have to do something myself. It actually occurred to me, actually belatedly, and that's why the first line of my first segment is, for 4 months, I've been waiting in vain for the North American media to pursue questions about the startling events of September 11th. And that wasn't like script writing, that was just a person speaking.
Right.
You know, it was no trouble to write that script at all. That was a very easy script to write. And so I hope that there's some sort of a parallel with non-journalist citizens around the world, that finally they would say too, I've got to do something myself. We can't wait for the media, we can't wait for governments, it's got to be citizens.
And that's what's happening. I mean, each of us are citizens, and we're looking at it and seeing, you know, that the official story simply doesn't bear out. And in addition to that, you want to say something about that?
I want to add a little bit about the lack of media coverage.
Yes.
I had looked very carefully on using the LexisNexis search engine, looking for every story you could possibly find on this topic. Interestingly, a couple days after 9/11, there was a story in the Miami Herald where the reporter said, This slow fighter response on 9/11 is going to be the source of much debate, and in the upcoming days. And you look, and there's nothing. And you have to remember that at the time the president's polls were at 90%, and Dan Rather later came out and said that spoke to the BBC and said that. A reporter being critical of the Bush administration in the months after 9/11 was like being martyred, like being literally set on fire, is the way he described it. There was, about 6 months later, there was a story in Slate, which is an online magazine, pretty decent, and it was called Ignorad. It was a play on words of ignore and NORAD, the military response. And they pointed out the fact that it's so remarkable that there hasn't been any media coverage of it. Yet that was 2 years ago from now. And we still don't see any media coverage from the mainstream media. So it's really remarkable that even after all this time, there's absolutely nothing.
Well, I think you had said in The Great Deception some historical precedents for how the government has used terror and had the complicity of the media historically through time in order to mobilize the American people into, or other peoples around the country, around the world, into getting involved in wars. Could you just sort of review those quickly?
Well, the one example within recent memory was the infamous alleged incubator baby deaths that were inflicted in a Kuwaiti hospital by the invading Iraqi soldiers in 1991, and this was a case where the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to Washington,
crying during the
a very good acting job. The thing is that right on that very day, the journalists there at that hearing could have inquired more carefully and more closely, and in the few days after, they certainly could have done that. They failed miserably. There's a book by Mark Hertsgaard about the Washington Press Corps called On Bended Knee, and that's about as close as the Washington Press Corps gets to asking any questions. And so that, of course, enabled the Desert Storm to take place. But perhaps a worse one, and I'll be very brief about this, is not a war-triggering thing, but I looked a lot into the assassination of Martin Luther King. I did a two-part TV series about that. And in 1999, there was actually a 30-day-long civil trial in Memphis, Tennessee, in which the King family brought a suit against the U.S. government, specifically named the CIA, U.S. Army Intelligence, and they named people and they named institutions. And at the end of that 30-day trial, which was a jury trial, which is half black and half white jurors, they found unanimously that the U.S. government was responsible for a conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King. And that trial wasn't covered. There was one guy covered the trial, Wendell Stacy, at a Memphis TV station. And he said he wanted to cover the trial, and when he kept going day after day, his bosses said he shouldn't, and he was fired. So he sued them for wrongful dismissal, and he won. But the thing is, there are very large things in American society that the media in America do not want to look at and will not look at.
So this is also has to do, if you could talk just briefly about what happened, obviously Pearl Harbor, and there's a Norwoods document. Could you talk about that in terms of historical precedents that shows that the government and even, the media complying with it, furthering, we could say, the propaganda message is what you were presenting over the weekend.
Yeah.
Well, Operation Northwoods was a notorious plan hatched by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to basically blame Cuba, set up a...
When was this?
It was in the late 1960s to set up, to contrive...
62.
62, yeah. To contrive a terrorist attack on the United States, which would be blamed on Cuba. And the documents, they were actually, I think, they were first publicly really discussed by James Bamford in the Body of Secrets. But they were actually originally unearthed, I think, by the National Security Archive at George Washington University. And they're there, you can look for them online and read them, and they absolutely makes clear that the general structure and the pattern of what happened in 9/11 has been there before. This is the clear precedent of a U.S. military, or leaders of U.S. military, considering for political purposes to conduct a war and contrive a terrorist attack against that would kill U.S. citizens to justify this war plan. And once you realize that this pattern was there, that this structure was there, and that John F. Kennedy vetoed it, then you realize that, well, it's perfectly possible, it's perfectly feasible, that look at what happened on 9/11. Is it possible that this was the same thing? This was a successful Northwoods operation.
And can you also, there's a new book out called The New Pearl Harbor, and George Bush even proclaimed that this was the 21st century Pearl Harbor. What do we know about Pearl Harbor?
Well, before one of us answers that question, I'd like to just do a little follow-up on Operation Northwoods. I think it's very interesting that really nobody had any idea about Operation Northwoods until finally Freedom of Information Act. 40 years later, this information comes out. And Senator Bob Graham has said about 9/11, he's referred to it as a cover-up, and he says it'll take 20 or 30 years before the truth finally gets out about what happened on 9/11. This is one of our prominent senators. Whereas I don't think we should wait 20 or 30 years. It's going to be an arcane, parlor game at that point. We have to find out now what happened in 9/11. And what happens is that there's all these horrible things that happen, just like this Operation Northwoods, where they're actually talking about using an airplane and crashing it into the ground to fool the American public. We can't wait 30, 40 years.
You're absolutely correct. Just, I want to get it, when we talk about the government and its use of the CIA, could you talk briefly about how the CIA, how American funding went into the creation of the Taliban, and more specifically, our relationship with Pakistan and ISI and General Mohammed?
Well, that's a very interesting subject, and it's a very lengthy subject as well.
Yes.
I mean, the Taliban, going back to the Cold War, that was when the first links between Al-Qaeda and the United States were created. And Pakistan and Saudi Arabia were two major proxies through which the United States managed to funnel the aid, funnel the military support, funnel the financial linkages to Al-Qaeda. Now, what happened subsequently is that in the post-Cold War period, this linkage didn't actually disappear. There's a book by Professor Jostadowski discusses this, but there's a very good book by Richard Lebivier, who's a Swiss TV journalist, and he quotes a CIA analyst who basically says that, well, actually, when we created Al-Qaeda, we didn't just intend to use them in Afghanistan. We thought about using them to destabilize Russian power and Chinese power, and to expand outside of that area, which is an extraordinary admission, because subsequently this is what occurred. And if we look at the history of Afghanistan, we can see how it's been well documented. I mean, Ahmed Rashid is a famous journalist who's done a book on this, Taliban, and it documents how since 1994, at the very least, the United States was funding these various factions which went on to form the Taliban. And by 1996, when they conquered Kabul, that entire thing occurred with U.S. military support, to the point that we have the Baltimore Sun, for example, and other newspapers reporting that the entire salaries of Taliban officials were funded by U.S. taxpayers.
Can you move forward and go into Pakistan and how the head of ISI was actually in the United States just prior to 9/11 and afterwards, including the amount of money that he actually gave to Muhammad Atif?
I'd be happy to answer that.
Thank you.
I think it's a stunning fact that we've had some media reports. We can't confirm them because there hasn't been really the investigative journalism to follow these things up. But we have some media reports that the head of the ISI, the Pakistani Secret Service, Mahmoud Ahmed is his name, that he ordered $100,000 to go to the lead hijacker, Muhammad Atta.
While he was in Washington.
Well, that order may not have happened while he was in Washington. We don't know when that order happened. It was probably about a month before, from what I've been able to determine. But in the months before 9/11, there were an increasing number of communications and meetings between people in the ISI and people in the United States. We have George Tenet going to Pakistan, and he's the head of the CIA, and meeting with his colleagues over there. We have this general of the head of the ISI, Mahmoud Ahmed. He comes to Washington. He is actually in Washington meeting with prominent senators and Congress people the very morning 9/11 was happening.
The head of intelligence for both the Senate and the House.
Right.
Is that correct?
Somebody walked into the room, handed a note when these people were having their meeting, they were in the middle of talking about Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, hands them a note saying the World Trade Center has been hit, and sitting in that room is Mahmoud Ahmed, who, as far as we know, was the man who ordered the money to make the hit happen. It's truly incredible, and it's something that the mainstream media, they've reported this piece and that piece, but they've never put these pieces together in just a blatantly obvious way about, here's one story, here's another story. There just has been no connecting of the dots.
Exactly. I want to thank you, all three of you, for the enormous breakthrough work that you have done. You can see that the unanswered questions that are not being even begun to be approached by the Commission are being unveiled by people around the world and serious researchers. What you presented today is appalling, if not, and certainly frightening. And we want to thank you very much for unveiling some of the historical precedents, some of the international intrigue, and unfortunately the fairly obvious, it appears to be, complicity of members of the American government and its relationship with its CIA and the ISI, which has, and we can go into in future conversations, clearly a motive that brought about 9/11, and it's a very difficult thing for the American people to confront, and we thank you for helping Americans from England, from Canada, getting the word into, and from on the internet, getting the word out, so that not only can truth but also accountability emerge out of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Was this our latest Christina or another Reichstag?